Okay, so I'm going to quickly identify and talk about 4 manifestations of loss, and then I'm going to give you the opportunity to pause here and do an exercise with each other. I'm going to give examples on each one of these. So when people experience loss, there's actually 4 kinds of reactions that we'll often see. So one of them is disengagement. And here's what happens in disengagement. The person actually withdraws their energy from their work, from the other people who they're working with. They will acknowledge that the change is happening outwardly, but what they do is they insulate themselves from it. And the way they do that is by shutting down and doing things like not talking, spending a lot of time by themselves in their office. Okay. I was, one of the things that I did in one point in my career is I had a consulting contract with a large organization, a large oil and gas company. And the organization was going through a lot of changes, and some of it impacted my work in a very dramatic way. And I remember, I wasn't aware of what I was doing so much at the time, but I remember disengaging. And in fact, I came to work every day, hardly acknowledged anybody, and went and sat in my office and did what I was doing. And I did that for about a week in a row. And one day, one of my colleagues, his name was David, walked into my office, opened the door, and he said, "What are you doing in here?" He said, "For goodness sakes," he says, "I'm getting tired of this." He says, "Would you get back on the team and start being yourself again?" And I looked at, I started to laugh because I had disengaged. Now, he and I were close enough friends that he actually could do that with me, and brought it to my attention what I was doing. Now, I notice that part of my pattern is when there's a lot of change is that I will do that. I'm very much aware of that now, and so I go, okay, re-engage here. Don't pull back. Don't pull back your energy. So the way this looks from the outside is that the person has quit, but they're still there. Disidentification. This one is Back to the Future, and I don't mean the movie here. But what happens is when a person becomes disconnected from the roles, from the relationships, from all the things that defined who they are, is that they begin, it becomes a question like this: I don't know who I am anymore. So the telling phrase is this: I used to be, and they don't finish that. Might be, I used to be the technical expert, but I don't know who I am anymore around here. And the person will spend a huge amount of energy and time reminiscing about the past. So when my mother died, my mother and father had been married for 40 years. I think that's a pretty long time. And I remember the first year after she died that my father spent all of his time talking about when he was in the Air Force. That was before he was married to my mother. It was like there was a gap of 40 years. And he was talking about all of this, and he was reminiscing about his time there. And that was one of the ways that he actually kept himself from experiencing the loss so much. In organizations, here's one organization where I was working, there was lots of change. There was a group of the managers, and they were sitting around, and they said, "Geez, do you remember the old days when we used to, on 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon, where we used to pull out the cards and play bridge? Wasn't that fun? And then after that, we used to go and read, and you know, there's all this reminiscing that was going on about the good old days." Disenchantment. This one is the hardest often for us to deal with, and this is when people become angry. So all the loss, they get stuck in anger, frustration, and worry. It affects other people, and it's very much the victim kind of an attitude. Oh, poor me, and lots of blaming will go with that. You talked about that. Bashing the organization, bashing the leadership, doing all of those things. Often this disenchantment, this blockage, playing God, ain't it awful, is about the other person experiencing disidentification, or particularly disidentification will be in the background of this one. And then finally there's disorientation, and this is playing Trivial Pursuit. And this is when the person doesn't know what's up or what's down, doesn't know where they fit in, everything looks chaotic and unreal, and they spend all their time trying to figure out what to do. Rather than ordinarily we'd be saying, okay, here's what I need to do. How am I going to do it? And they'll be asking constant kind of questions in this kind of, okay, now what's happening? What am I supposed to do next? Where are we going? What did they just say? So very much this kind of a disorientation. And what I see with this one is that often this happens more as we go through the other disses, that a person will fall into this kind of a disorientation. Have you seen any of this in the organization with any, or experienced any of this yourself as a result of some of these changes? Yeah? Okay. Well, here's what I'd like you all to do. I've talked enough for a while. It's your turn. And if you notice, there's on page 10 and page 11 in your handouts, there's one that's called self-management, and then the second one is a partner interview. So what I would like you to do with each other is take each other through these questions. And I'll give you about 15 minutes to do this. Now, there are some, find someone who you feel comfortable with talking about this, and then just begin to identify the answers to the questions. So what are you telling yourself about the change? Just identify the kind of self-talk that you've been engaging in. And there's some very important questions here. What do you fear losing? And then there's a question that says, what have you lost? Now, I want to tell you that often we fear losing things, and it's simply not true. So it's useful to identify that as simply a fear, but then also to be truthful about, but what have I really lost? Part of being able to go through endings is about being able to be in reality, to actually face and acknowledge truthfully to ourselves what's going on. What do you need to let go of? So often we need to let go of things. We need to let go of beliefs that we've had about ourselves. It could be beliefs that we've had about the organization, beliefs about the importance of our work, beliefs about things like, God, I want to tell you one that because of my stage in life, I truly was raised in a career world where the way this worked was you started working for one organization, you worked there your whole life, and then you retired with that organization. Yeah, that didn't happen. Didn't happen for my husband, never ever happened for me. And I remember when it really hit, my husband was downsized in an organization. He was one of the folks who left an organization. And I remember what a hit that was to both of us, because that wasn't the plan. And it was like, okay, new plan, I get it. I made that up. I believed that was the case, and yet when it was a real eye-opener for me to go, no, that's not how it works. The world is different than what I thought it was going to be. So I want to just pause here for a second. Part of that goes back to this disenchantment. So one of the things that happens with disenchantment is that we begin to realize that the reality that we created about the world is often only in our own head. So first disenchantment that most of us experience in our life is when we're about 6 or maybe 5. Someone tells you, often a rumor in the schoolyard, there's no Santa Claus. I know, there's always people in the room who are shattered by that one. And then furthermore, it gets worse. There's no Easter Bunny, and there's no Tooth Fairy either. An interesting thing is that those things, you know, you think about it, kind of like hard. I remember this year, my oldest grandson, he really got it that there was no Santa Claus. But he decided that he wasn't going to break it to his little sister. He was going to let her have one more year of believing that there was a Santa Claus. And he also had to get clear with me that it still meant that he was going to have some presents. Of course you're I said, well, the presents have always come in the past. Do you think they're going to stop now? No. So it was fun as he's been going through this process. But then there's the other disenchantment, the one that I described. But here's another disenchantment. Have any of you ever found out after believing that your friends were perfect that they weren't? Or someone who you had completely idolized, who you had up there and you thought, oh my goodness, and all of a sudden you discover that's not the case? Or the leader or somebody else in the organization that you believed in, and all of a sudden you saw that, no, that's not the case. That person is human. Now, the great thing about disenchantment is that it actually allows us to engage in life more fully and in a more real way. And it's not always fun to go through the disenchantment process. So this question is, these questions, like the question, what do I need to let go of, is really looking at some of those beliefs. Okay, so you've got the questions in front of you. I'd like to give you about 15 minutes to do this exercise, and about 7 minutes for each one of you. Ask the questions of your partner, make some notes, and really let your partner have their experience. And there's nothing you need to do other than to listen. Self-reliant, happy, healthy daughter. It's very positive. Let her have the experience she was going to have.
Oh yeah.
What's the first step you take to get what you want now? And breath too, right?
Today. So I just want a few comments. What did you notice in doing the exercise? Just a few things that you noticed.
When he's trying to notice reflection, and you could see happy and a little bit of sadness and happy again, and
yeah, so you could actually observe as people were doing this, the shift in some of the emotions from happy to sad. Okay. Anything else you noticed?
Cautious optimism.
Cautious optimism. So what do you mean by that?
Seeing the difficult changes are happening and will continue to happen, but understanding that there is possibly a silver lining to those changes. You have to look hard for it at times, but perhaps it is there.
Yes, yeah. And that's an important thing for us to do, is to be able to stay clear about where we're going and what this is all meant to take care of and address. Yes, thank you. What else?
Some clarity, I guess, in some respects of, when you think of what you're fearing losing, and then when you think about, is it really true or not? And really thinking through that, and is what you're fearing losing a story that you're telling yourself? Or is it something that is really real?
Well, boy, so it really asks you to test whether or not what you're telling yourself is true. And here's one of the things I recommend. Don't believe everything you tell yourself. It's always a good idea, because boy, some of the things we make up is quite amazing. And remember that part of organizational change is that often things are changing so quick and people forget to tell people about things that are happening, and in the absence of information we make things up. And we do not make up good stuff. It's like, oh, where do we go? We go off and we make up things that are often really scary. Yeah. Anything else that you noticed? No? Anything different here?
Maybe uncertainty and how you're actually going to deal with some of this stuff. Like you can maybe anticipate you might react one way or another, or you might plan one way or another, but you're not really sure, and you're kind of voicing it to another person, so it makes it real.
Mm-hmm. So when you see that you're not sure, that you have this uncertainty about where you're going, what does that enable you to do then?
More personal reflection, I guess, and to also reflect back on what your personal values are, and how you'd like to move forward, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So it's an opportunity to begin to say, well, it's an opportunity to take charge of yourself.
Right.
And I would really encourage you all, there's a question there that says, what do I want from others? Did you look at that question? What do I want from others? You know what? Sometimes we need to make requests of other people around us. And for some reason, we sometimes forget. We think we need to do the whole thing by ourselves. And remember, in the environment where there's some lack of trust and where it's self-preservation, we often don't reach out. So endings are the time that is most painful. It's the time where it's grieving. So there's shock, there's denial, there's bargaining, there's anger, there's a kind of sadness, depression that precedes acceptance. And people in organizations go through the grieving process exactly the same way as we do when there's a death in the family. We may experience it differently, but there will be those elements of that. So here's some of the things I'd like to sum up this area with. So these are strategies that we can all use. So identify and acknowledge the losses that you're experiencing. And I really encourage you to find trusted and other people who you can talk about with this. Listen to each other and talk to each other, because one of the things that often that people will do is they'll begin to isolate themselves. And when you've lost some of your trusted relationships, it's really easy to isolate yourself. So looking for people outside of the organization often is very useful when there's a lot of organizational change. Ask yourself, what's the loss behind the loss? So I want to give you an example. At one point in some of the work I was doing, the organization I was working with decided to bring in another change program. And I was central to what was going on. And when they did that, it was a loss of this program. But that wasn't what the loss was. The loss was that I wasn't consulted. The loss was one of feeling that I was able to influence the direction. And I remember I had a little bit of hard time with that. So I really needed to look at what was the loss behind the loss. Expect and accept that there's going to be some of the signs of grieving around you. Sometimes it won't be you, sometimes it's going to be somebody else. We need to define what's over and what's not over. So I'd like to tell you that you only need to change 15 to 20% of an individual's job for them to feel that the whole job has changed. It's like, oh my God, everything, oh, it's like, everything changed. Now, that's the alarmist, and then there's the other people who just go, oh my goodness, everything's changed. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go in my office and try to figure it out. Okay, so define what's over and what isn't, and this is a great conversation to have in your teams. Identify areas of continuity both personally and organizationally. So if everything is changing in the organization, find continuity at home. If it feels like there's a lot of change that's going on at home, then sometimes the organization will actually give us some continuity. And if there's neither places, then we'll look to your support network, because this is one of the best indicators of how people experience change and how well they navigate is, remember, this support system that you have. Mark the endings, and ceremonies are very important here. Retirements, retirement parties, that's what they're about. They're about marking an ending. And there's often things that we can do organizationally to mark the ending. I'll give you a quick example. In one organization where I consulted, we'd made a shift in this whole system. And this organization was the size such that they could have something called a great big meeting where everybody would come. And the head of the organization came in one day, and it was really a shift from usual job descriptions to accountabilities. He brought in a stack of these old things, and he stood there. Now, we would have lit it on fire, but that, it was against the fire rules. He took them all, and he threw them in the garbage, and he says, "We're not using these anymore. Here's what we're using." And it was a great indication that said, okay, that's done. Beware of the rumor mill, really, truly. The rumor mill, most of the information is false, and what it does is feed our fears. And go to your leader, find out. And if they don't know, ask them to find out. So rumors are very dangerous. Get information that is accurate. Okay, so I want to just end this part by giving you a story. There was a priest, two priests, and they were walking along one day, and they came to a stream. And on the edge of the stream, there was a young woman standing there, and she had long robes, and she was having a hard time. She couldn't get across the water. So one of the priests offered to carry her. So he lifted her up, put her on her back, and carried her across the river. And they'd been walking, two priests, for the rest of the day. And near the end of the day, the one looked at the one who'd carried the young woman, and he said to her, "I've been thinking about that young woman all day, and I think that you broke your oath. I don't think you should have carried that young woman across the water. That wasn't right." And the priest who'd done it looked at the other one, and he said, "Well, that's funny." He said, "I put her down on the edge of the path on the stream." He said, "You've carried her with you the whole day." And you see, that's what endings are about. They're about letting go. They're about, that's over. And it doesn't mean it's easy, but it's a really important thing for us to do.